Good morning, everyone. I guess three quick things. Number one is I'm very grateful to d10e because my great-grandmother was Lithuanian, and this is my first time here, so I feel like I'm sort of exploring my roots, and without blockchain and crypto or d10e, I would have never come back to the motherland. So I'm very happy to be here, and good morning. And this is true despite my last name being Einstein. So somewhere there's a Lithuanian name. That's number one. Number two is this presentation can be mostly on how to raise US capital in a compliant way, but I want to clear something up because there seems to be what's called FUD out there, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It is the case that the United States Securities and Exchange Commission is being aggressive with its rhetoric, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it's absolutely not the case that under US law, every token is a security, nor is it the case that every token that's sold in an ICO is going to be treated as a security. Now, since I prepared this deck, the SEC has set up a sub-website on the main SEC page. It's actually sec.gov/ICO, and they say that tokens may be securities, including those issued in ICOs, depending on the facts and circumstances, okay, which is actually correct as a matter of law. So this market is still alive, it's still useful. I guess the third point before I start is this is sort of a list of things not to do so that you can be compliant. I generally presume that everyone in this room is a good faith actor, that you're interested in advancing the state of the art, that you want to make the world better. But there's no doubt that there's a lot of bad actors out there in this ICO blockchain world. I want to sensitize the room to the issues because it's important for us as a community to set a standard, to sort of self-regulate so that the bad actors get isolated. And so we, the good actors who care about following the law and doing things right, set the standard. And this puts us in a very powerful position to reach out to and work with regulators when we're keeping ourselves up here and not down here. So these are sort of red flags to look out for so that we can sort of self-police the community and take this revolution to where it needs to go. So this is actually a slightly old version of the deck. The new version of the deck says not the SEC. So just be clear, I'm not with the SEC. This is still accurate. I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer, probably. So I have to say that as a US attorney, but it's nice to meet you anyway. Okay, so standard disclaimer. I'm going to bring up some ICOs that went bad during this presentation. I have nothing against these people. Sometimes I go to audiences and they know them. This is all just on Google, right? So it's all pulled from Google. There's no insider information here. The general principle is don't be a headline. It's not glamorous. There's the expression all publicity is good publicity. That's not true when the SEC or the US government's involved. So just in case you're wondering. This photo right here is from recent Senate testimony in the United States. On the left, we have the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. On the right, we have the chairman of the Commodities Future Trading Commission, or Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, CFTC. The gentleman on the left, Chairman Clayton from the SEC, has been pretty aggressive in his rhetoric about ICOs in terms of what he says. In terms of what goes on the SEC website, not so much. And seeing this testimony, I think some people got disheartened about the situation in the United States. By way of contrast, the chairman of the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission had 2 points of view. On one hand, he recognized that as a regulator, he is responsible for protecting the market. He's responsible for protecting investors. But he also pointed out that at home, at the dinner table, his kids, his adult children, they don't talk about stocks. They don't talk about bonds. All they talk about is Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain, and tokens. Like every single night, he has to get an earful from them about this new technology. So he's expressed an openness to what's happening and realizes that there's some potential utility or use out there. So it's a mixed bag in the United States. When you go one row over, one column over, that's an order from the SEC to an ICO called Munchie that I'll talk about. It's an interesting situation, and I'll kind of dive into it right now. The there's some questionable things about the ICO they were conducting, and rather than the SEC filing a lawsuit or the black helicopters showing up and people coming out with AK-47s, rather than any of that, the SEC picked up the phone, called them, and said, the thing you're about to do is probably against the law, stop now. Now, I don't know what it's like in Lithuania, but in the United States, if you're about to go rob a liquor store, the police don't call you up and go, you know that liquor store you're about to rob? Would you mind not doing that today? Can you like hold off on that while we figure out what the law is? I mean, think about that. We had a government agency calling and stopping an action, but not imposing sanctions, not taking anyone off to jail. So it's not as if the regulators in the US are totally against us, they're just trying to figure it out. By way of contrast, if you look at the next row over, or column over, that's Arise Bank. In cases where there's actual fraud, and I'll go into what fraud means, in cases where there's actual fraud, the SEC and other government agencies are coming down like a wall of bricks. So there's a difference between sort of an innocent mistake situation and fraud. If you commit fraud in the US and really anywhere else, they're after you. They're after you whether it's an ICO, they're after you whether it's regular securities offering, they're just after you. So just be sensitive to what fraud is, and I'll go over that. Here's a more subtle example. There's an ICO called Paragon Coin, which is related to the cannabis, the marijuana or cannabis industry. Believe it or not, that gentleman right there, he's not a rapper. I don't know why they put him in this picture, but there's a rapper named The Game, and I've never heard any of his songs, nor do I want to. But he was hired by Paragon Coin to talk about how great it was. Well, that's in US securities law, it's called touting. Talking up a token or a good because you're paid to, and you're not telling the world that you've been paid. That's a no-no. You have Tezos, which probably many of you have heard of. Tezos didn't do anything illegal, but what they forgot to do was treat their startup like it's a startup. So what happened is there's a huge lawsuit right now between the couple that started Tezos and the gentleman who they appointed to run the Tezos Foundation. They got in a huge fight over power and profits. So that's what happens when you maybe conduct a legal ICO but don't take care of forming your entity correctly. And just another one that got suspended because of fraud. So let's go into some details. There's 5 rules or principles I want to throw at you, and again, just to sensitize you to what's going on in the industry so that we can self-police and do a better job of making this whole thing work. The first rule when you're doing an ICO, or really anything else in life, is don't lie. It sounds so basic, but it's amazing how much of this I see out there. Lying in connection with an ICO, whether it's a security or not, and definitely when it's involving a security, is fraud. Okay, fraud has consequences. So what is a lie? You know, if I go outside and it's raining, but I say the sky is blue and sunny, and no one listens to me and no one cares, I may be lying, but I'm not committing fraud because it's not material to someone's life or existence. A lie that matters under law is a misstatement of material fact, or an omission or leaving out of a material fact, usually with intent that someone rely on the fact that I'm lying so that they make a mistake. So a material fact is not the sky is blue when really it's raining. It's some examples I'll go over below. So again, material fact, something that a reasonable person would take into account when deciding whether to invest, to buy, to sell, to hold, or to hodl a Bitcoin or another crypto. Okay, so let's do 3 fast examples. And these are real. So example number 1 was some ICO saying, we have large holdings of real estate, diamonds, and gold. Invest in our token because we're backing up our token with all this good stuff. When in fact, they were basically had about $3 left. That's obviously something material. You wouldn't buy that token if you knew that fact, and they were lying about it. The second example is a little bit more subtle. That's when you take something that's true and you exaggerate it beyond normal sales, or really at all. So suppose you have a platform where you claim we have thousands of active users and our platform is built and we're ready to go, when in fact you have an alpha version, 3 users, and one of them is your mother. Okay, that's an exaggeration that becomes material because it's enough of an exaggeration. Here's the tricky one, and it's more subtle, and I'm seeing this tripping up a lot of people who are offering securities and people who are engaging in ICOs. It's a lie of omission. In other words, it's a lie of leaving something out. Generally, if you're quiet, you're not lying. You know, silence is not a lie. Okay, maybe you should say something, but if you're quiet, you're not lying. But if you say something that's true, for example, we have $10 million of assets backing up our token. Well, suppose that's true. Suppose you really do have $10 million backing up your asset or your token. But you leave out the fact that you have $100 million of debt. Right? So the first part's true, and you're not actually lying, but you're leaving out something that's critical. That's a lie of omission. And that's going to be fraud under securities law. Okay, no one would do this. This would never happen. Well, this is the SEC coming down on RE coin, real estate coin. Real estate coin actually had no real estate, but I think it was like they were aiming for it. And then we have Arise Bank, which is another case of fraud. So ripped from the headlines. Okay, rule number 2, or principle number 2. Blockchain and crypto and tokens are all, of course, very cutting edge. They're technology plays. But with the exception of Bitcoin, really every single one of these has some sort of entity or business or foundation standing behind it. There's real people who are not distributed, who are not decentralized, who are running some business that is conducting an ICO or supporting the product or teaching people how to use it. That's a startup, and you need to treat your startup, like a traditional startup. What does that mean? It means you have to, number one, form in the correct jurisdiction. Now, I've really enjoyed meeting people from Lithuania the past day or so, and I knew this was a hot area for ICOs. I didn't understand until very recently just how good this market, this country is becoming. So, quite possibly, Lithuania is the right place to launch your ICO. This is where you all clap. Yeah, great-grandmother. Okay, so if my great-grandmother had only known that this would be an ICO hotbed, she would never have left. Okay, so every startup, wherever you're located, you need to have agreements between the relevant parties. You need to have agreements between the founders, the employees, the advisors, the board members, the contractors. This is critical. And Tezos, as you recall, when you had a fight between the couple that started that company and the person who's running their foundation, that's because they did not have the proper agreements in place. If they had bothered to do that, it wouldn't have played out like that. You know, and everyone's friends at the beginning, but people start fighting, they get divorced, all kinds of crazy stuff happens, and once you're past your first 100 million, people get a little bit more mercenary. The time to put those agreements in place is now, at the beginning. Related to that is point number 3. Keep in mind that every blockchain and every crypto startup is fundamentally about technology. People are developing this technology for you. They're either going to be employees or contractors or some company that's doing it for you. It's unusual for one person to be doing the whole thing. Well, you need to have agreements in place where that valuable intellectual property that's being created really belongs to your startup. It's not being licensed, it's not being gifted, it's not a verbal agreement. By the way, there's an expression in the United States, verbal contracts are worth the paper they're written on. In other words, they're not. So get it all in writing. And just one thing to consider, you may have a very good relationship between everyone. Well, that's great, but suppose your main developer is some guy, and he's your best friend, and you love him. That person would never betray you. Well, guess what? He gets divorced, and he's from California, which means his wife now owns half, and she hates you. So get everything documented. Related to this, and especially the jurisdiction idea, is focus on tax issues. I think everyone is aware of the utility versus security distinction. When you sell securities, you don't owe tax. And I'm down to 43 seconds, as always. Okay, when you sell something that's not securities, you probably owe some form of tax. The rate may be different, but just be aware. All right, let me go. Tezos, founding issues. Autonomous, my favorite. It's a company that was built on smart contracts. They didn't need boards. They didn't need law. They had smart contracts. They had crypto. Well, guess what? The founders are now suing each other in regular court in Singapore. So I guess autonomous wasn't really that autonomous. Okay? Take care of your startup issues. Okay, rule number 3. This is very controversial, and I have been speaking about this topic around the world. The consensus, at least in the United States and probably also in Switzerland and some other locations, is that if you sell your token before it's functional, it's a security at least during the pre-functional period, even if it won't be a security later. So the cure for that is to use something called a SAFT, a simple agreement for future tokens. Just the headline I want you to take away from this is, do not sell your tokens to the general public before they're functional, before the platform works. If you're raising money to build that platform, issue these documents called SAFTs, S-A-F-T, Simple Agreement for Future Token. Also, let me say, if you add me on LinkedIn and message me, I will send you this deck. I do it all the time. So I see a lot of people taking pictures. Just add me on LinkedIn, message me, I'll give you the whole deck. Okay? This is Munchie being shut down because the one I talked about where they called them up, they didn't commit fraud, but they were selling a pre-functional token. The SEC called them up and said, stop. The funny thing is, in their white paper, they were actually explaining how they weren't a security. So think about the irony of that. They had a nice white paper doing a Howey case analysis, we're not a security. What the attorney forgot was she was selling a token before it was functional. Therefore, at least for that pre-functional period, the SEC and a lot of the world views that token as a security. Number 4, do not talk up the expected return on investment of your token. That goes to another part of the Howey test, which is the expectation of profits on the part of the buyer. The more you talk about the fact that your token will go up in value, the more it's beginning to sound like a security, even when it's not. So don't talk about it being listed on an exchange. Don't talk about it appreciating in value. Okay, it's really, the idea is it's not going up in value. The idea is that it's becoming more useful over time as you build up the platform, which should be the truth. Don't pay bloggers, celebrities, all those other people to talk about how great your token is. That's the example I gave before. That's touting, right? You don't need to do that. Just talk about the platform, how good it is, and how good it will become. Also, I've seen this so many times, do not have an intern run your Telegram channel, okay? When you get that 18-year-old intern, no matter how smart that intern is to run your Telegram channel, that person will talk about the massive returns that can be expected from the token. It's just, it will happen. I've seen it a million times. And the SEC and investors are gonna look at that channel. Naomi, I'm almost done here. I know you're looking at me. Okay, final note. The days of the SEC, CFTC, IRS, FBI not looking are over. They are awake, they're watching. I actually think this is a good thing because we're going to start having compliant global ICOs, but they're watching. So play nice. Again, they're not completely down on crypto, right? They know that Bitcoin is not a security. They have also sort of through the back door acknowledged that Ethereum is not a security. They could have said that in the Dow report, but they didn't. And again, the SEC is talking tough, the CFTC a little bit less so, but just be sensitive that they're trying to protect investors, they're trying to protect the public, follow the rules from before, make sure that your colleagues do, and let's have blockchain and crypto be very successful. Yes. Thanks for the extra minutes, I appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here, and let's go on.